Wow, the 20th century, huh? I mean, it's crazy when you think about just how much changed in that relatively short span of time.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. The world wars, the rise and fall of these really powerful ideologies, technology that just seemed to explode.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine trying to keep up with it all as it was happening.
As we're thinking about those massive forces that kind of shaped our world, there's this one story that we can't ignore. The story of Christian missions during the 20th
Right,
century.
right, because it wasn't just happening in isolation, right?
Yeah.
Missions were right in the thick of all of that upheaval and change.
Absolutely. It's this really fascinating story full of these unexpected turns, facing intense opposition, but also witnessing these incredible moments of growth. It's a real paradox.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today, folks. We're going to really explore how missions evolved and adapted throughout the 20th century based on some really solid historical analysis.
Think of it like a fast track to understanding the key shifts and the big takeaways. We're not going to get bogged down in all the little details, just the essential stuff.
Exactly. Think of it as like the greatest hits of 20th century missions.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, greatest hits might not be the best phrase because, as you alluded to earlier, there were definitely some tough times too, some real low points.
True, true. Okay, maybe more like a curated playlist.
There you go, that's better.
Yeah.
A playlist that captures the highs, the lows, and everything in between.
Perfect. All right, let's start with what our sources describe as the turbulent seasons of the 20th century. There's this historian, Kenneth Scott Latourette,
Oh yeah, I've read some of his work.
who really saw this period as a continuation of the 19th century. You had all these advances in technology, shrinking the globe, the telegraph, the telephone, steamships. And it was creating a sense of a global culture emerging, which was being shaped by science.
What's really interesting is that you would think all that interconnectedness would bring people together, make things easier, create a sense of unity. But almost right away, you see this intense political instability popping up everywhere.
It's almost like the world was still figuring out how to handle all this new interconnectedness. And it led to more friction, not less.
Exactly. And the optimism people had at the start of the century about easily solving global problems, that quickly faded away.
And then, bam, you have 2 world wars. The impact on missions must have been, well, I can't even imagine. So many lives lost, relationships destroyed. But then there's this interesting point in our sources about how those wars, in a kind of twisted way, ended up accelerating scientific and technological advancements.
It's almost like the wars became this massive, tragic laboratory for innovation out of necessity. And that, in turn, ended up providing new tools, new opportunities, and I guess you could say new problems for missions down the road.
It's kind of like that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly. Now, right after World War II, there was this period that missiologist Ralph Winter called the 25 unbelievable years.
Okay, I've heard of that phrase, but never really understood what it meant.
Yeah, it's a really important concept. It captures that sense of just how crazy those years were. You had all this transition and trauma still rippling out from the war, but you also had this surprising sense of optimism, and a huge amount of progress was made in missions.
One of the big things our sources talk about is how the center of gravity for Protestant missions shifted to North America by 1945.
Right, because the war had completely devastated European missions. They just didn't have the resources or the infrastructure to keep up the same level of work they were doing before.
So you had this vacuum that American churches and missions kind of stepped into.
Precisely. It was a huge shift in global Christian dynamics. Now, at the same time, more and more countries began closing their doors to foreign missionaries.
China being the most obvious and probably most impactful example.
Definitely. That expulsion of missionaries from China was a major turning point, and it had all of these ripple effects that are still felt today.
So what happened to all those missionaries?
Well, a lot of those experienced missionaries who'd spent years in China, they didn't just pack up and go home. Many of them pivoted and started working in other parts of Asia. At first, they often focused on the Chinese diaspora communities scattered throughout Southeast Asia, but eventually they began reaching out to the local populations as well. It was an adaptation born out of necessity, but it ended up opening up new avenues for missionary work.
It's pretty remarkable how they took that setback and turned it into new opportunities. But then you've got the rise of communism, and that casts a huge shadow over most of the 20th century. I mean, it's mostly viewed as this failed system now, but for decades it was a major force. and often a brutally oppressive one.
No doubt about it. And its impact on the global Christian church was immense. We're talking about the systematic expulsion of missionaries from countries under communist rule, and I mean all over Eastern Europe, Asia, places like China, North Korea, Vietnam.
Yeah, it was like a domino effect, wasn't it? One country after another fell under communist control.
Exactly. And tragically, in a lot of those nations, there are these deliberate attempts to dismantle the church altogether. Millions of Christians were martyred for their faith.
It's tough to even comprehend that level of persecution,
Hmm.
especially in the modern world where we often take religious freedom for granted. But what's striking is just how resilient the Christian faith was in those places.
It's incredible, isn't it? The sources really emphasize that despite these brutal attempts to wipe out the church, it not only survived, in many cases, it actually thrived.
It's like all that pressure actually made it stronger.
In a way, yeah. It forced Christians to be more creative, more reliant on each other, and more deeply rooted in their faith. You saw the growth of underground churches, these clandestine networks of believers who met in secret. It was an incredible testament to the power of faith under duress.
So then you have this major shift in the 80s with Gorbachev in the Soviet Union and the whole glasnost thing, leading to the fall of the Iron Curtain. I mean, that completely reshaped the religious and political landscape.
Right. Suddenly, you have these regions that had been closed off for decades opening up, and there was this huge resurgence of religious practice as people who had been forced to live under atheistic regimes were finally free to explore their faith.
Speaking of reshaping the landscape, we can't forget about nationalism, which was another huge force throughout the 20th century. The number of independent nations just exploded, especially as European colonialism started to crumble.
It's crazy to think about it. The UN went from having like 51 members to over 190 during that time. Talk about redrawing the map.
It must have completely changed the way missions operated.
Absolutely. It's often referred to as the retreat of the West. As European powers lost their political control, the whole dynamic of missions had to shift.
But it wasn't always a clean break, was it?
Not at all. In many cases, even though formal colonial rule ended, economic influence and inequalities continued. That's what's called neocolonialism. And unfortunately, as these new nations emerged, sometimes minority groups ended up facing discrimination or even persecution.
It's like this double-edged sword, isn't it? Independence brings freedom and self-determination, but it can also create new tensions and challenges.
For sure. And it's interesting to think about the unintended consequences of some of the things missionaries did, like the Western education systems they often set up. Those actually ended up playing a key role in fueling desires for independence in many colonized regions.
Because they introduced new ideas and ways of thinking and raised people's awareness of what was happening in the world.
Exactly. They gave people the tools and the knowledge to challenge the status quo. So as these nations gained their independence, it led to a really important shift in the relationship between Western missionaries and the local church.
It was more about partnership and less about control, right?
That's exactly it. The emphasis increasingly moved towards what's often called the three self principle: self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating.
So basically, local churches taking ownership of their own leadership, their finances, and their own efforts to share the faith.
Exactly. And that led to a real strengthening of indigenous ministries. They were no longer just extensions of Western churches. They were becoming truly independent and self-sufficient.
So while all this dramatic political and social change was happening, Christianity itself was going through some pretty major upheavals. It's wild to think that despite very little support from governments in many parts of the world, it actually expanded geographically at an unprecedented rate.
And it became far more representative of the non-European world, which was a huge change. It wasn't just a Western religion anymore. It was becoming truly global.
Okay, so let's talk about the ecumenical movement. It seems like part of the driving force behind it was this desire for unity and global evangelization.
Yeah, there was this growing sense that if Christians could work together more effectively, they could have a much greater impact.
Kind of like united we stand, divided we fall, right?
Exactly. So you started seeing these early attempts at cooperation between different mission organizations. Things like comity agreements, where they'd divide up territories to avoid stepping on each other's toes.
Like, you take this region, we'll take that one, and we'll avoid unnecessary competition.
Precisely. The problem was those agreements often fell apart. Sometimes because of theological differences, sometimes because of arguments over methodology, and sometimes just because populations moved and the original boundaries no longer made sense.
It sounds like there were a lot of growing pains.
Definitely. But you can't deny that there was a real desire for greater unity. One of the key figures in this whole movement was John R. Mott. He led the student volunteer movement and the World Student Christian Federation.
Oh, yeah, the student volunteer movement. Wasn't that a pretty big deal back in the day?
It was huge. They sent thousands of young people into missions. Mott was a really charismatic and inspiring leader, and he had this vision of mobilizing students for global missions on a massive scale.
So it wasn't just about high-level talks between denominations. It was about getting young people fired up about missions.
Exactly. And then there's the 1910 World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh.
I've heard that was a pretty landmark event.
It was absolutely groundbreaking. For the first time, you had official representatives from practically every Protestant missionary society coming together to talk about the major challenges facing missions. It really laid the groundwork for the formation of the International Missionary Council, or IMC, in 1921.
So the IMC was all about trying to coordinate efforts and come up with strategies for global evangelization.
Right, and they did that through a series of world conferences that took place over the next several decades. But as the ecumenical movement was growing, you also started seeing these theological cracks emerge, particularly with the rise of theological liberalism.
So this was a more progressive view of Christianity that questioned some of the traditional beliefs, right?
Yeah, things like the necessity of salvation for those who haven't heard the Christian message. It caused a lot of tension within the movement.
That makes sense. Were there any specific examples of this?
Well, the Jerusalem Conference in 1928 was a big one. That's where you really saw the divide between the liberals and the more conservative evangelicals becoming clear. And then there's William Ernest Hawking's book, Rethinking Missions.
Oh, I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, it was pretty influential. It basically argued that social improvement and what he called redemption were more important than individual evangelism.
So it's not just about getting people to convert. It's about making the world a better place through social action.
Exactly. Now, obviously, that view didn't sit well with everyone, especially the more conservative evangelicals.
It sounds like it really shook things up.
Oh, yeah. At the Madras Conference in 1938, you saw a real pushback from the evangelical side. They were all about re-emphasizing the importance of biblical faith and the priority of evangelism, actually sharing the gospel and calling people to conversion.
So instead of just focusing on social change, it's about changing hearts first.
Right. But it's important to remember that this tension between these liberal and evangelical viewpoints, it didn't just disappear. It continued to play out, often in some pretty messy ways.
I guess you could say that's still happening today in some ways, right?
Definitely. Okay, so this fundamental split eventually led to two distinct paths within Christian missions. On the one hand, you had the formation of the World Council of Churches, or WCC, in 1948. They were all about organizational unity, bringing different denominations together.
But what about the evangelicals? Where do they fit in?
Well, our sources suggest that the WCC often downplayed or even ignored some of those core evangelical doctrines, and they weren't always as focused on evangelism as the evangelicals were.
So the evangelicals were kind of left out in the cold.
Not entirely. They started forming their own organizations, like the Interdenominational Foreign Mission Association, or AFM, back in 1917, and then the Evangelical Foreign Missions Association, or EFM, in 1945.
So it was like their own parallel track for missions.
Exactly. They provided a space for missions that were more theologically conservative and more focused on evangelism. It's interesting, too, because later on you have this movement called 82,000 and Beyond, which was an attempt to try and bring evangelicals together for global evangelization.
So it's like, let's work together towards a common goal, but without creating this big controlling structure.
Right. It was more about collaboration than control. What's really interesting is that when you look at the trends, there's a pretty stark contrast. You see declining membership and missionary numbers in a lot of the denominations aligned with the WCC, while evangelical missions were experiencing this huge growth spurt.
Okay, so we've talked about the world wars, communism, nationalism, and even internal divisions within Christianity itself. Wow, it really was a turbulent time. But I think we need to talk about one more major development that really shook things up: liberation theology.
Yeah, that was a pretty radical shift in thinking that emerged in the late 60s, especially in Latin America.
Okay, give me the rundown on liberation theology. What's it all about?
So you have Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru, who's considered one of the founders. He was looking at the extreme poverty and oppression in Latin America and saying, hey, the church needs to do something about this. We can't just sit back and preach the gospel while people are suffering.
Sounds pretty revolutionary.
It was. They were basically proposing, exactly. It had a huge impact on political movements, especially in Central America during the 80s.
It's amazing how a theological idea can have such real-world consequences.
Absolutely. But it's important to note that liberation theology faced a lot of criticism and rejection, especially from evangelical Christians. They felt it was a distortion of the Bible's message. They argued that while Christians should absolutely care about social justice, the primary goal should always be spiritual transformation, not political revolution.
It's like they were saying, sure, we need to care about people's physical needs, but we can't lose sight of their spiritual needs.
Right, but even though it's controversial, liberation theology did raise awareness about injustice and oppression, and it challenged the church to take those issues more seriously.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Now we can talk about something a little more lively, the Pentecostal explosion.
Yes. The Pentecostal explosion. You can't talk about 20th century Christianity without talking about this. It's a remarkable story of growth, energy, and, well, let's be honest, sometimes a little bit of controversy.
Okay, I'm ready. Tell me everything.
So, Pentecostalism has its roots in the early 1900s, mainly in the U.S. You have these small groups of Christians who are experiencing these really intense spiritual phenomena, things like speaking in tongues, divine healing, prophecy.
And it wasn't just confined to one denomination, right? It was this kind of cross-denominational movement.
Exactly. It was a grassroots thing. Places like Kansas and the famous Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles were key early centers. And from those humble beginnings, it spread like wildfire.
And it wasn't just in the U.S., right?
Nope. It quickly spread throughout the world, especially in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. We're talking about exponential growth, way faster than other Christian traditions.
So what was it about Pentecostalism that resonated with so many people?
I think it was a combination of factors. First, their emphasis on personal experience and the power of the Holy Spirit. People were drawn to this idea of a God who wasn't distant, but who was actively involved in their lives, working through them in tangible ways.
Yeah, that idea of having a direct personal relationship with God is really appealing.
Absolutely. And Pentecostal churches were often very welcoming to people from all walks of life, especially those who felt marginalized or excluded by other churches. Plus, their worship services were lively and engaging, full of music, dancing, and emotional expression. It was a far cry from the more formal and restrained services of some traditional denominations.
It's interesting, too, how Pentecostalism has influenced those more traditional churches. Think about all the charismatic movements that have sprung up within mainline denominations.
Oh, absolutely. The influence has been huge. Even if people didn't fully embrace Pentecostal theology, they were attracted to some of the practices, like speaking in tongues, prophecy, and healing.
So it wasn't just about starting new churches. It was about changing the way people experience faith.
Exactly. It was this injection of passion and energy that really shook things up. And, it's also worth noting the role of women in Pentecostal churches. They often played a much more prominent role in leadership and ministry compared to some other Christian traditions.
That's a really important point. So we've got all this intense turbulence going on in the 20th century, and it's forcing missions to adapt in some pretty dramatic ways. That brings us to what our sources call transitional solutions.
Right. These were innovations in how missions were understood and carried out, and they were driven by both necessity and this incredible burst of creativity.
Like when the going gets tough, the tough get creative, right?
Pretty much. So our sources break these innovations into two categories: new approaches for old concepts and new approaches for new concepts.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's start with those new approaches for old concepts.
All right, one of the most interesting developments was the rise of faith missions. Now, this wasn't a brand new idea. It had roots in the 19th century with Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission, but it really took off in the 20th century.
Okay, remind me, what's the basic idea behind faith missions?
Basically, it's this radical trust in God to provide. Instead of actively fundraising or soliciting donations, faith missionaries rely solely on God's provision through the prayers and voluntary gifts of supporters.
So it's like a step further than just regular tithing.
Yeah, you could say that. And it was really effective. The China Inland Mission, which was later renamed Overseas Missionary Fellowship after they had to leave China, was hugely successful. They had thousands of missionaries working all over China, and they were pioneers in many ways.
They also had that really fascinating story of how they dressed like the Chinese people they were trying to reach, which I guess was pretty controversial at the time.
It was. It speaks to this idea of cultural sensitivity and trying to build genuine relationships with people.
But getting back to faith missions, what were some of the other key organizations that emerged?
Well, you have Wycliffe Bible translators, for example, whose whole focus is translating the Bible into every language on earth.
Wow, that's a pretty ambitious goal.
It is, but they've made incredible progress. And then you have organizations like Campus Crusade for Christ, now called CRU, which focuses on reaching students on college campuses all over the world.
So what's so new about faith missions? Isn't it just about how they get their money?
Well, it's more than that. Because they weren't tied to traditional fundraising models, they were often much more willing to take risks, try new things, and go to places where others weren't willing to go.
So they were kind of like the innovators of the mission world.
Yeah, you could say that. They were pioneers in things like using radio to broadcast the gospel, aviation to reach remote areas, developing Bible correspondence courses, and even using recordings and film for evangelism.
It's amazing how they embraced these new technologies.
They were way ahead of the curve. They also developed innovative approaches like saturation evangelism. That's where you try to saturate a whole area with the gospel message using all means possible. It's kind of like a full court press.
That's an interesting analogy.
And they were big proponents of theological education by extension, or T. That's all about taking theological training out of the traditional seminary setting and making it accessible to people in their own communities.
So instead of requiring people to uproot their lives and move to a different country, you're bringing the training to them.
Exactly. It was a game changer, especially in parts of the world where access to formal education was limited. Okay, so another old concept that went through a radical transformation in the 20th century was Bible translation.
Okay, now that's something I can get behind. I mean, the Bible is pretty important for Christians, right?
You could say that, but for centuries, Bible translation was a pretty slow and laborious process, and it was often done in ways that didn't always reflect the heart language of the people.
Heart language, what does that mean?
It's the language that people really connect with on a deep level, the language they think in, the language they dream in. It's more than just understanding the words, it's about feeling them in your soul.
I get it. So how did things change in the 20th century?
Well, there's this guy named Cameron Townsend, and he had this amazing aha moment while working as a missionary in Guatemala. He was trying to share the gospel with a group of indigenous people, and one of them asked him, "If your God is so smart, why hasn't he learned our language?"
Ooh, that's a pretty good question. It kind of puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
Right. So Townsend realized that if people were truly going to understand and embrace the gospel, they needed to hear it in their heart language.
Makes sense. So what did he do about it?
Well, he founded this organization called Wycliffe Bible Translators, which is still going strong today. They've trained thousands of people to do linguistic work and Bible translation, and they've made incredible progress in making the Bible available in more and more languages.
That's pretty amazing. But didn't Bible translation work also involve some pretty dangerous situations?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's that famous story of Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, who worked with the Auca Indians in Ecuador.
Right, that's a tragic but inspiring story.
It is. It highlights the incredible dedication and sometimes the very real dangers that missionaries face, especially when working with isolated people groups.
So along with all these new approaches for old concepts, we also see the emergence of some completely new ideas in missions. One that stands out is the increasing emphasis on research and understanding the dynamics of how Christianity spreads.
Absolutely. It's kind of like missions finally caught up with the scientific revolution. Instead of just relying on intuition or tradition, people started to say, hey, let's actually study how churches grow. Let's analyze what works and what doesn't.
I guess it makes sense. I mean, if you're trying to be effective, you need to understand how things actually work, right?
Exactly. And that's where Donald McGavran comes in. He did this groundbreaking work on understanding people movements, which is basically how whole communities come to faith rather than just individuals. His work led to the birth of the church growth movement, which really revolutionized how many people approached missions.
So it's not just about getting individual converts. It's about understanding the larger social dynamics at play.
Precisely. And the academic study of missions, or missiology as it's called, really started to take off. People were using insights from anthropology, sociology, and psychology to better understand the cultural context of missions.
So it's not just theology anymore. It's a multidisciplinary field.
Exactly. And there was an explosion of research organizations and publications. You have MRC, the U.S. Center for World Mission, OMSC, the Billy Graham Center, and even research divisions within denominations like the Southern Baptists.
And all this research was providing valuable data about global religious trends, which helped shape mission strategies.
Absolutely. And one of the things it highlighted was the need to adapt to major demographic changes, like the massive population growth in the developing world and the rapid urbanization that was happening.
So missions had to learn how to reach people in cities, not just rural areas.
Exactly. That was a huge shift.
Now, one concept that really captured people's imaginations and directed mission efforts was the idea of the 1040 window.
Yeah, that was a game changer. It really helped focus attention on the parts of the world that were considered the least reached with the gospel.
Okay, break it down for me. What exactly is the 1040 window?
It's a geographical area that spans from West Africa all the way across to East Asia. Basically, it's between 10 and 40 degrees north latitude. It includes the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. And the thing is, that region is home to the largest concentration of unreached people groups.
Unreached meaning?
Meaning they have very little access to the gospel. Either there's no Christian presence there, or the existing churches are too small or too weak to effectively reach their own people.
So the 1040 window concept was really about shining a spotlight on the need to reach those specific areas.
Exactly. People like Ralph Winter and Louis Bush were instrumental in popularizing this concept, and it really energized missions in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And it went beyond just geographical regions. It also led to this focus on identifying and reaching specific unreached people groups, which are basically ethno-linguistic groups that don't have a viable indigenous church.
So instead of just focusing on countries, you're looking at specific groups of people within those countries.
Right. And it led to some really innovative strategies, like the use of strategy coordinators.
What are those?
They're kind of like specialized missionaries who focus on researching and developing culturally sensitive ways to reach these unreached groups. And often they don't even have to live in the target area. They can do a lot of their work remotely.
So they're kind of like the intelligence agents of missions.
I like that analogy. They gather information, develop strategies, and then work with local partners to implement them. Okay, one last big shift we need to talk about is the changing face of the missionary force itself.
In what way?
Well, for most of Christian history, missions were primarily a Western enterprise. Missionaries went from Europe and North America to the rest of the world. But in the 20th century, you start seeing a major shift.
So more missionaries from non-Western countries.
Exactly. The two-thirds world mission movement really took off, and it's still growing today. You have missionaries from Africa, Asia, and Latin America going to other parts of the world, including the West.
It's amazing how the center of gravity has shifted.
It really is.
Yeah.
And alongside that, you have the increasing importance of tent makers.
Okay, I've heard that term, but I'm not really sure what it means.
It's basically Christians who use their professional skills to work in countries that are closed to traditional missionaries. So they might be teachers, doctors, engineers, business people. They have regular jobs, but they see their work as a platform for sharing their faith and building relationships.
It's like they're blending in, flying under the radar, and living out their faith in a very practical way.
Precisely. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, it's pretty clear that the 20th century was a period of massive upheaval and change for Christian missions. But it was also a time of incredible innovation, resilience, and growth.
It's really inspiring to see how they adapted to all those challenges and found new ways to share their faith. And like Latourette said, the impact of these events is still unfolding today. It makes you realize that the story of Christian missions isn't just a dusty old history book. It's a living, breathing narrative that's still being written.
And that brings us to the big question for you, the listener. After hearing all of this, what stands out to you as the most significant trends in 20th century missions? What do you think the future holds?
It's a lot to think about.
It is, but it's important to remember that, as John Polhill once said, the book of Acts is yet to be completed. The story of missions isn't over. New chapters are being written all the time, and who knows what amazing things God will do in the years to come.
I guess that's where we all come in, right? We each have a part to play in this ongoing story. Thanks for listening, folks.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.